3 weeks ago, I came home from deployment 6 months early to surprise my wife for our anniversary and found my identical twin brother Luke living in my house, wearing my clothes, sleeping in my bed, and playing the role of devoted husband to a woman who apparently hadn't noticed she'd been married to the wrong man for half a year. I'm 29 years old, and I've been serving in the Marine Corps for 8 years. But nothing in my military training prepared me for walking into my own kitchen and watching my wife Felicity kiss my brother goodbye as he left for the job I'd arranged for him before my deployment, using the truck I'd bought, carrying the lunch she'd packed in the container I'd given her for our first anniversary. My name is Logan, and my identical twin Luke has been both my closest ally and my biggest liability since we were born 3 minutes apart in a military hospital in North Carolina where our father was stationed as a Navy medic. Growing up as identical twins in a military family meant we were often mistaken for each other by teachers, neighbors, even extended family members who saw us infrequently. But our parents and close friends could always tell us apart because our personalities were completely different despite our matching DNA and mirror image faces. Where I was disciplined, focused, and goal-oriented from an early age, Luke was impulsive, charismatic, and allergic to responsibility in ways that made him charming to strangers but exhausting to anyone who had to depend on him for anything important. I joined the Marines straight out of high school because I wanted structure, purpose, and the opportunity to serve something larger than myself, while Luke drifted through community college, part-time jobs, and a series of relationships that always ended when his romantic partners realized that his surface charm masked a fundamental inability to commit to anything that required sustained effort or sacrifice. I met Felicity 4 years ago during a brief leave between deployments, at a coffee shop near the base where she was working as a barista while finishing her nursing degree. She was beautiful, intelligent, and refreshingly unimpressed by military uniforms or the kind of smooth talking that usually worked on women who hung around military bases looking for excitement or financial security. It took me 3 months of careful courtship to convince her to go on a first date, and another year of long-distance communication during my next deployment to build the kind of trust and connection that could survive the challenges of military life. We married 2 years ago in a small ceremony attended by both our families, including Luke, who served as my best man despite his obvious skepticism about my decision to marry someone I'd only spent a total of 8 months with in person due to deployment schedules and training commitments. He made jokes during his best man speech about how Felicity was getting the better end of the deal since she'd have a husband who was gone most of the time and couldn't monitor her activities or make demands on her attention. Comments that I brushed off as typical Luke humor, but that probably revealed more about his character than I wanted to acknowledge at the time. For the first year of our marriage, everything worked better than I'd dared to hope. Felicity proved to be exactly the kind of military wife who could handle the challenges of deployment life, independent enough to manage a household and career on her own, but committed enough to prioritize our relationship despite the distance and uncertainty that came with loving someone whose job required frequent absences. She finished her nursing degree, found work at a civilian hospital, bought furniture for our first house, and created the kind of stable home base that made my deployments feel like temporary separations rather than permanent abandonment of civilian life. But 6 months ago, when I deployed to Eastern Europe for what was supposed to be a routine 9-month rotation, I made a decision that seemed logical at the time but turned out to be the biggest mistake of my military career. Luke had recently lost another job due to his chronic inability to show up consistently or follow basic workplace rules. And he was facing eviction from his apartment because he'd spent his rent money on a motorcycle he'd wanted instead of prioritizing his housing obligations. Felicity suggested that maybe he could house sit for us during my deployment, helping with maintenance and security while giving him a stable place to live and an opportunity to get his life back on track. I was hesitant about the arrangement because I knew Luke's history with responsibility and commitment. But Felicity convinced me that having someone in the house would give her peace of mind about security and that maybe giving Luke a chance to prove himself would help him mature into the kind of reliable adult our parents had always hoped he'd become. She pointed out that identical twins should be able to trust each other with their most important possessions, and that this could be an opportunity for Luke to demonstrate family loyalty while building stability in his own chaotic life. Against my better judgment, I agreed to let Luke stay in our house during my deployment, with the understanding that he'd handle basic maintenance, help Felicity with any heavy lifting or repairs she couldn't manage alone, and use the stable environment to find steady employment and start rebuilding his financial independence. I even arranged a job for him at a construction company where I had connections, figuring that steady work and a stable living situation might be exactly what he needed to finally get his life together. But what I didn't anticipate was how easy it would be for Luke to slide into my life completely, taking advantage of our identical appearance to become me in ways that went far beyond simple house-sitting or brotherly assistance. When my deployment was cut short due to a training accident that left me with a minor injury requiring stateside treatment, I decided to surprise Felicity by coming home early for our anniversary instead of calling ahead to let her know about the change in my return date. I wanted to walk through our front door and see her face light up with joy and surprise at having her husband home unexpectedly. Instead, I walked through our front door and found myself looking at a version of my life where I'd never left for deployment, where my wife had been living with my identical twin brother who'd apparently been playing the role of devoted husband so convincingly that she either hadn't noticed the substitution or had chosen not to question why her husband's personality had changed so dramatically during his absence. The moment I walked into my own house and saw Luke in my kitchen wearing my favorite weekend shirt and making coffee in the machine Felicity and I had gotten as a wedding gift, I understood that whatever had been happening during my deployment was far more complicated than simple house-sitting or brotherly assistance. He looked up from the coffee maker with an expression of pure panic, his face cycling through shock, guilt, and calculation as he tried to figure out how to explain why he was making himself at home in my life while I was supposed to be thousands of miles away serving my country. But what shocked me more than finding Luke in my kitchen was realizing that he'd been living as me rather than simply living in my house. He was wearing my clothes, using my coffee mug, following the morning routine I'd established with Felicity during our brief periods together between deployments. When I heard footsteps on the stairs and Felicity's voice calling down that she'd be ready in 5 minutes, I realized that my wife was about to come downstairs expecting to see her husband and would instead find herself face to face with the real version of the man she'd apparently been living with for months. Luke started to speak, probably to offer some explanation or excuse for the situation. But I held up my hand to silence him as Felicity appeared at the bottom of the stairs wearing her nursing scrubs and the kind of bright smile that used to be reserved for me during my brief leaves home. She looked at me, then at Luke, then back at me with an expression of confusion that slowly transformed into something that looked like recognition mixed with horror. For several seconds, the three of us stood frozen in a tableau of domestic disaster, with me in my military uniform holding a duffel bag, Luke in my civilian clothes holding my coffee mug, and Felicity in her work uniform holding her purse while her brain processed the fact that there were two identical versions of her husband standing in her kitchen. The silence stretched until I finally broke it by asking the question that I already knew would destroy whatever remained of my marriage. I asked Felicity how long she'd known she was living with Luke instead of me, and her answer revealed the scope of deception that had been taking place in my house during my deployment. She said she'd figured out the switch about 2 months after I'd left, when Luke had done something completely out of character and she'd confronted him about the change in his behavior. Instead of confessing immediately, Luke had convinced her that deployment stress and military training had changed his personality, that he was trying to be a better husband by becoming more spontaneous and attentive to her needs. What followed was the most surreal conversation of my life, with my wife explaining how my identical twin brother had gradually revealed his true identity while convincing her that their relationship was an improvement over the marriage she'd had with me. Luke had told her that he'd always been in love with her, that he understood her in ways I never could, that the time they'd spent together during my deployment had shown both of them what their relationship could be if she was married to the right twin. Felicity admitted that she'd initially been angry and confused when she'd learned the truth about Luke's identity, but that he'd persuaded her to give their relationship a chance before making any decisions about telling me or ending the deception. He'd argued that she deserved to experience love with someone who was present and available rather than constantly deployed, someone who prioritized her happiness over military career advancement, someone who shared my faith but offered a completely different approach to marriage and partnership. The most devastating part of her explanation was her admission that she'd begun to prefer Luke's version of our relationship to the reality of being married to me. She said that Luke was more romantic, more spontaneous, more emotionally available than I'd ever been during our brief periods together between deployments. He'd cooked for her, planned surprise dates, spent hours talking about their future together in ways that made her feel valued and prioritized rather than like an obligation he maintained between military commitments. Luke finally found his voice and tried to explain his perspective on what had happened during my deployment. He said that living in my house and following my routines had made him realize how much he'd always wanted the kind of stable, committed relationship I'd built with Felicity. He claimed that pretending to be me had taught him what it felt like to be responsible, reliable, and genuinely devoted to another person's well-being and happiness. He argued that the deception had started innocently, with neighbors and coworkers assuming he was me and him not bothering to correct their assumptions. But as time went on and he'd gotten to know Felicity better, he'd realized that they had a natural compatibility that went beyond his physical resemblance to her husband. He said that telling her the truth and pursuing a relationship with her hadn't been planned, but that it had felt like destiny once they'd acknowledged their feelings for each other. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Luke and Felicity trying to justify 6 months of deception while I processed the complete destruction of everything I'd thought I knew about my marriage, my brother, and my life. They spoke about their relationship like it was a romantic comedy rather than a betrayal that had involved identity theft, adultery, and conspiracy to defraud me of my marriage while I was serving overseas. But what hurt most wasn't just the betrayal itself. It was the realization that both Luke and Felicity seemed to believe that their deception had been morally justified because it had led to what they considered a better relationship than my marriage had provided. They talked about their connection like it validated the months of lies, as if discovering love through identity theft and adultery was romantic rather than devastating for the person whose life had been stolen and whose trust had been violated. When I finally asked what they'd planned to do when I returned from deployment, their answer revealed just how completely they'd disconnected from reality during their months of domestic fantasy. Luke said they'd been hoping I'd be understanding about the situation, that I'd realize Felicity was happier with him and would agree to step aside so they could be together officially. They'd apparently convinced themselves that I'd be grateful to learn that my wife and brother had found love together, as if betrayal became acceptable when it resulted in happiness for the people who'd conspired against you. The conversation ended with me telling both of them that they had 24 hours to figure out where Luke would live and how they planned to handle the legal and practical consequences of 6 months of fraud, adultery, and identity theft. I said that I'd be staying in a hotel while they made arrangements, but that I'd be returning to my house in exactly 1 day to reclaim my life and begin divorce proceedings that would reflect the true nature of what they'd done during my deployment. The 24 hours I spent in a downtown hotel room while Luke and Felicity figured out their next move felt like the longest day of my military career, filled with a kind of helpless rage that made me understand why some people make decisions they regret for the rest of their lives. I alternated between staring at the ceiling and pacing the small room while processing the complete destruction of my marriage and my relationship with my twin brother, trying to figure out how two people I'd trusted with my life had convinced themselves that 6 months of systematic deception was acceptable because it had led to their happiness. The legal consultation I scheduled for the morning after discovering Luke and Felicity's betrayal provided some clarity about my options, though none of them offered the kind of satisfaction I was craving. The lawyer explained that while Luke's identity theft and fraud were potentially criminal matters, prosecuting him would be complicated by our identical appearance and the fact that Felicity had been a willing participant in the deception once she learned the truth about his identity. More problematic was the reality that proving adultery in a no-fault divorce state wouldn't necessarily give me significant advantages in asset division, especially since Felicity could argue that she genuinely believed she was in a relationship with her legal husband for the first 2 months of Luke's deception. The lawyer suggested that my best strategy would be to focus on the financial fraud aspects of Luke's impersonation, since he'd been using my identity for employment and other legal purposes while I was deployed. But what I learned during that legal consultation was less important than what I realized about myself during the long night I spent alone in that hotel room. The anger I felt toward Luke and Felicity wasn't just about betrayal, it was about the recognition that my marriage had apparently been so superficial that my wife couldn't tell the difference between me and my brother for 2 months, and had actually preferred the imposter once she'd figured out the truth. When I returned to my house the next evening, I found it empty except for a note from Felicity explaining that she and Luke had moved into an apartment across town and would be staying there while we worked out divorce proceedings and the legal issues related to Luke's impersonation. She left my personal belongings organized in boxes, my military gear cleaned and properly stored, and the house in better condition than I'd ever seen it, as if maintaining my property had been some kind of penance for destroying my marriage. The note included an apology that managed to be both comprehensive and completely inadequate, acknowledging that they'd hurt me while maintaining that their relationship had developed naturally despite its deceptive origins. Felicity wrote that she hoped I'd eventually understand that love couldn't be controlled or predicted, that she'd never intended to fall for Luke but couldn't deny the connection they'd discovered during my deployment. Luke had added his own note, a rambling explanation of his actions that revealed just how little he understood about responsibility, loyalty, or the consequences of betrayal. He wrote that he'd always envied my ability to build stable relationships and achieve goals, that living my life had taught him what he was capable of when he had the right motivation. He claimed that stealing my identity had been wrong, but that falling in love with Felicity had been inevitable, as if being a better version of himself somehow justified destroying my marriage. Over the following weeks, the practical details of untangling the mess Luke had created during his 6 months as me proved to be almost as complicated as processing the emotional betrayal. He'd been working at the construction job I'd arranged for him, but using my name and social security number, which meant that his employment history was now part of my official record. He'd established credit accounts, signed contracts, even gotten a traffic ticket while pretending to be me, all of which required legal intervention to correct. The divorce proceedings moved forward with the kind of clinical efficiency that made the end of my marriage feel like a business transaction rather than the dissolution of what I'd thought was a loving partnership. Felicity was cooperative about asset division and didn't contest my claims about Luke's fraud, perhaps because her lawyer had explained that fighting me would expose her to potential criminal charges for conspiracy and accessory to identity theft. But the most surreal aspect of the divorce process was having to prove that I was myself rather than my identical twin brother, since Luke's impersonation had created confusion in official records about which twin had actually been married to Felicity. I had to provide military deployment records, fingerprints, and witness testimony to establish my legal identity and my rights to marital assets that Luke had been using while pretending to be me. The criminal investigation into Luke's identity theft proceeded slowly, with prosecutors apparently reluctant to pursue charges that would be difficult to prove and unlikely to result in significant penalties. The detective assigned to my case explained that identity theft between identical twins was legally complicated, especially when the victim and perpetrator shared the same family history and physical characteristics that made the impersonation believable. 3 months after discovering the betrayal, I received a call from our parents asking me to meet them for dinner to discuss the situation with Luke and Felicity. They'd apparently been trying to mediate between us, hoping to find some way for our family to heal from the damage Luke's actions had caused. The conversation was awkward and painful, with our mother asking me to consider forgiving Luke because he'd finally found stability and love, as if his happiness justified the destruction of my marriage. Our father, a military veteran himself, was more understanding about the betrayal of trust that Luke's actions represented. But he also encouraged me to think about whether pursuing criminal charges and maintaining permanent estrangement was worth destroying our family relationships. He pointed out that Luke had always struggled with responsibility and impulse control, that maybe this relationship with Felicity had finally given him the motivation to become a better person. The most difficult part of that family dinner was hearing about how happy Luke and Felicity appeared to be together, how settled and committed they seemed in their new relationship. Our parents described seeing them at family events and social gatherings, noting that Luke had become more reliable and mature since moving in with Felicity, that their relationship seemed to bring out the best in both of them. But what our parents didn't understand was that Luke's happiness and personal growth had come at the cost of my marriage, my trust, and my ability to believe that the people I loved most were capable of basic loyalty and honesty. I didn't care that Luke had finally found motivation to be responsible if that motivation required stealing my identity and destroying my relationship with the woman I'd planned to spend my life with. The conversation ended with me explaining that I couldn't have a relationship with Luke while he was living the life he'd stolen from me. That seeing him with Felicity would be a constant reminder of his betrayal and her willingness to participate in 6 months of deception. I said that maybe someday I'd be able to forgive them both, but that forgiveness would require them acknowledging the full scope of what they'd done rather than treating their relationship like a romantic love story that had unfortunate origins. 2 years have passed since I discovered Luke living my life and sleeping with my wife. And the resolution of that betrayal has taken forms I never could have predicted when I first walked into my kitchen and found my identical twin brother making coffee in my house. The divorce from Felicity was finalized 8 months after I returned from deployment, with asset division that reflected the financial fraud Luke had committed while impersonating me. More importantly, the legal proceedings established clear documentation of his identity theft, creating a permanent record that would follow him regardless of how his relationship with my ex-wife developed. The criminal charges against Luke were eventually dropped due to prosecutorial discretion and the complications of proving intent in an identity theft case involving identical twins. But the investigation had served its purpose by creating legal documentation of his actions and exposing him to potential future prosecution if he ever attempted similar deception. The detective explained that having the case on file would make any future identity-related crimes much easier to prosecute, essentially putting Luke on notice that his identical appearance wouldn't protect him from legal consequences. But the most unexpected development came 6 months after my divorce was finalized, when I received a call from Felicity asking if we could meet to discuss something important about Luke and their relationship. I was reluctant to have any contact with either of them, but her tone suggested urgency and genuine distress that made me curious about what might have happened to disturb the domestic paradise they'd created through deception and betrayal. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop near the base where we'd first encountered each other years earlier, and Felicity looked nothing like the confident woman who'd been living with my imposter brother. She was thinner, more tired, and had the kind of defeated expression that comes from discovering that fantasies don't survive contact with reality. She explained that her relationship with Luke had begun deteriorating almost immediately after they'd moved in together officially, once the excitement of their secret affair had been replaced by the mundane realities of actual partnership. According to Felicity, Luke had reverted to his previous patterns of irresponsibility and unreliability as soon as the novelty of playing house had worn off. He'd quit the construction job I'd arranged for him, claiming that manual labor was beneath someone with his intelligence and potential. He'd started spending money recklessly, expecting Felicity to cover their shared expenses while he pursued various get-rich-quick schemes that never materialized into actual income. More damaging to their relationship than Luke's financial irresponsibility was his apparent inability to maintain the personality he'd developed while impersonating me. Felicity said that the attentive, romantic, emotionally available man she'd fallen in love with had gradually disappeared, replaced by someone who was selfish, demanding, and resentful of her expectations that he contribute equally to their household and relationship. She admitted that she'd begun to realize that Luke's appealing qualities during my deployment had been performance rather than genuine personal growth. That he'd been playing the role of devoted husband because it gave him access to my life rather than because he'd actually become the kind of man capable of sustaining a committed relationship. Once he'd achieved his goal of winning her away from me, he'd lost interest in maintaining the facade that had made their affair seem like true love rather than simple theft. The conversation was painful for both of us, with Felicity acknowledging that she'd destroyed our marriage for a relationship that had been based on deception from the beginning. She said that living with Luke had taught her the difference between the man I actually was and the performance Luke had given while pretending to be me, and that she'd come to understand that she'd thrown away something real for something that had never actually existed. But what struck me most about our conversation was the recognition that Felicity's regret wasn't really about losing me. It was about discovering that Luke wasn't the improved version of me she'd thought she was getting. She'd been attracted to what she believed was my personality combined with Luke's availability and spontaneity, not understanding that those qualities were contradictory and unsustainable in the same person. I listened to her explanation and apology without offering forgiveness or reconciliation, understanding that her recognition of Luke's true character didn't undo the 6 months of betrayal that had destroyed our marriage. She'd made her choice based on the belief that Luke was better for her than I was, and the fact that she'd been wrong about his character didn't create any obligation for me to repair the damage her decision had caused. The conversation ended with Felicity asking if there was any possibility that we could rebuild our relationship, now that she understood what she'd lost and why Luke's promises had been hollow. I told her that trust, once broken as completely as she'd broken it, couldn't be restored through regret and recognition of mistakes. She'd chosen Luke over me when she believed he was the better option, and I couldn't be with someone whose love was conditional on comparative evaluation of available alternatives. 6 months later, I learned through family connections that Luke and Felicity had broken up permanently, with her moving back to her hometown and him returning to the pattern of job hopping and relationship instability that had characterized his life before he'd stolen mine. The relationship that had cost me my marriage and him his integrity had lasted less than 18 months beyond its deceptive origins, ending when the fantasy of transformation through love had collided with the reality of who Luke actually was. For me, the resolution brought a different kind of closure than I'd expected. Instead of satisfaction at their failure, I felt something closer to pity for two people who destroyed real relationships in pursuit of an imaginary one. They convinced themselves that betrayal could be justified by love, that deception could create authentic connection, that stealing someone else's life could lead to genuine happiness. The experience taught me valuable lessons about trust, identity, and the difference between loving someone and loving the idea of someone. Luke had been able to impersonate me successfully because Felicity had been in love with her image of what a husband should be rather than with who I actually was as a person. When Luke had presented a version of me that seemed more available and attentive, she'd chosen the performance over the person without recognizing that authenticity can't be faked indefinitely. My military career continued without the complications of deployment marriage, and I eventually found relationship with someone who valued consistency over excitement, authenticity over performance, presence over presence. Building trust with someone new required being honest about what I'd experienced and learned from Luke and Felicity's betrayal, but it also allowed me to appreciate qualities like loyalty and honesty that I'd previously taken for granted. The relationship with Luke remained severed, not because I'm unable to forgive, but because forgiveness doesn't require restoration of relationship with people who've proven themselves capable of fundamental betrayal. He'd stolen 6 months of my life and destroyed my marriage because he'd wanted what I had without being willing to build it for himself, and that kind of character defect doesn't disappear just because the scheme eventually fails. Sometimes the people who look exactly like you on the surface are completely different underneath. And sometimes the most important lesson you can learn is that sharing DNA doesn't create obligations to enable or excuse behavior that violates basic principles of loyalty and honesty. Luke had taught me that being identical twins didn't make us interchangeable, and that some betrayals reveal differences that can never be reconciled regardless of family connections or shared history.